About the synapse, we're going to look at the difference between chemical and electrical synapses. Now, we're really going to differentiate and distinguish them from each other, but I really want you to focus on the chemical synapse. We're only going to mention the electrical synapse. I'm going to talk a little bit about it, what you need to know about it, and really I only want you to know that it exists. Okay, it's not very common, and I'll talk about it when we get to that slide, but the focus here today is really on the chemical synapse. Everything else that we'll speak about for the rest of the day and the rest of the semester for the most part is really an example of the chemical synapse. So just make that note early, right? Make that note right away. So a synapse is basically a functional communication between one neuron and another cell that it is signaling or communicating to. Typically when this connection or this signaling happens in the CNS, it will be with another neuron, right? So neuron to neuron synapse. But when it's in the PNS, it will be between a neuron and some other type of cell, which we will eventually call an effector cell or a target cell. Okay, and that can be muscle, either cardiac, smooth, or skeletal. That can be glandular tissue, or that can be adipose tissue as well. Okay, so in the CNS, it's neuron speaking to neuron. And when I say CNS here, I'm referring to brain and spinal cord anatomically. And then outside the CNS, which is everything else, all our peripheral nerves, cranial nerves, this connection is between one neuron and another type of tissue, muscles, adipose, or glandular tissue. Now, if one neuron is signaling another neuron, the first neuron is a presynaptic neuron, the second one is a postsynaptic neuron. We talked about that relationship. Presynaptic, synapse, postsynaptic. And so there are different flavors, as I like to call them, of synaptic connections. We can have the presynaptic neuron synapsing onto different parts of the second neuron, different parts of that postsynaptic neuron. It can synapse onto the dendrite, and we explained where the dendrites are. It can synapse onto the soma, or it can synapse onto the axon terminal, the ending of the neuron. So there are three different types as a result: axodendritic, axosomatic, axoaxonic. By far the most common and the most, we'll see the most often in terms of different locations around the body are the axodendritic, and I'll draw out what that connection looks like in a minute. And then synapses can also be described in a different way. Okay, so don't confuse these categories. So we can describe a synapse as electrical or chemical, but we can also describe its anatomical relationship as axoaxonic, axodendritic, or axosomatic. Okay, so let's just describe what that means here. Okay, so we're speaking about the synapse. And just to describe it here briefly, we know that it's a functional connection. And it's going to be between one neuron and not necessarily another neuron, but another cell that it is signaling. But it could be a neuron, right? So one neuron and another cell that it is signaling. All right, now there are different flavors which we spoke about, but the two main types in terms of the two broad categories of synapses are chemical and electrical. Okay, and I'm really gonna highlight or underline the chemical synapse here because this is what we're really focusing on. And so just to draw what this looks like, we have our first neuron. Okay, it's communicating with a second neuron. And then some type of effector cell. Okay, so presynaptic neuron. Let me see that. Postsynaptic neuron. and then target cell. Target cell, effector tissue, effector cell, those terms are all interchangeable. Okay, whatever tissue that second neuron is synapsing onto is what we're talking about. And I'll talk about what those examples could be in a minute here. So the first neuron, just to describe these areas, we talked about them already, but the axon, right, the soma, the axon terminal here. And so this connection here is the first option for our chemical synapse. We can have one neuron synapsing onto another neuron. So this connection is what the synapse is. Okay, and this first option is going to be onto another neuron. Okay, and now we can also synapse onto some other structures here. Muscle being one, epithelial cells of glandular tissue being the second, and then adipose cells. Okay, hope you can see that. So this is muscle, glands, adipose. Okay, and this synapse is a second type of synapse, and this is more uniquely named. We typically call this synapse the neuromuscular junction. Or the neuroeffector junction. Okay, so two options to synapse. One is on the soma of another neuron. The other is on another cell, so another type of cell. Now let's demarcate exactly where in the nervous system this takes place. So typically when we synapse onto another neuron, this happens in the central nervous system, right? So central nervous system here, and that's going to be brain and spinal cord. And then when we synapse outside, right, onto another type of tissue, onto a muscle cell, onto adipose, onto glandular tissue, this happens outside of the CNS. So this is the PNS, the peripheral nervous system, and that's going to be everything outside the CNS, everything outside of brain and spinal cord. Okay? So just to review this here, we talked about what a synapse is. It's that connection between a neuron and another cell. Now we have two options for that other cell. The first one can be another neuron, so neuron to neuron. This is the traditional synapse. The second option can be another type of cell. That can be cardiac smooth or skeletal muscle, glandular tissue, or adipose tissue. And then we call this second type of synapse specifically either the neuromuscular junction or the neuroeffector junction. Okay? Let's look at the different I'll leave that for a second. Next, we're going to look at the different flavors for the connections between neurons. So we talked about exoaxonic, exodendritic, and exosomatic. Let's actually describe what they look like. Okay. Any questions on this, this first bit? Any questions? Okay. So here we're looking at the different types of synapses. Okay. And we have three options for the presynaptic neuron. And then on this side, we'll have the postsynaptic. Okay, so we have three types of connections. There are actually others, but we're really going to talk about three types. Okay, so these are all presynaptic neurons, and there are three options for what part of the second neuron this first neuron synapses onto. The first one is that it can synapse onto the dendrites of that second neuron. Right, and these are dendrites coming off here. And so the connection is happening along here. Okay, and this is called your axodendritic synapse. Spell this out. So this is another neuron here, and this is the axodendritic synapse. Okay, it's the most common, so I'm going to put a star here, and I'll talk about it more. Now, the second option to synapse for the terminal bouton is on the soma directly. Okay, so we have the soma here of a second neuron. Okay, and this is called the axosomatic synapse, right? The axosomatic synapse. Okay, and then the third option is to synapse onto another terminal bouton, another axon terminal, which is a very rare connection. This is not very often found in the body at all. All right, so the cell body would be this way, right? And then the synapse happens onto the terminal bouton of the second neuron. All right, and this one is called axonic. Axonic. Okay, very uncommon, very rare, very hardly found throughout our nervous connections, whereas the axodendritic is very common. It's the most often encountered. That's the one we're going to be speaking about extensively today. Okay, any questions on this? So it's really important for you to understand what the connection looks like in terms of understanding the big picture of what's happening as we speak about the events at the axon terminal.